police conduct or police misconduct. Citizens may, in fact, investigate allegations of police misconduct, and citizens will have a voice in resolving allegations that police officers engaged in wrongdoing towards other citizens. So that's generally what we mean when we talk about civilian oversight in this context. As I said, of the 200 oversight entities in the United States, there are lots of different models that have been adopted, and there's really no, each of them have weaknesses and strengths. I think there's no perfect model, certainly none that I've seen. Civilian oversight can mean that citizens actually conduct investigations into complaints of wrongdoing by police officers. And so there are a number of cities around the United States that have adopted that model, where they hire trained, professional investigators from the citizenry to conduct investigations into allegations of wrongdoing. And that tends to be in larger cities like New York, Chicago, Washington, and San Francisco are probably the biggest examples, and certainly the most prominent examples that have gone that route. Each of those cities has an agency full of citizen investigators looking into allegations of police wrongdoing. And I think there are some obvious merits to that approach. There's a sort of a conceptual, theoretical appeal of the idea that citizens will be conducting the investigation, but there are also some significant downsides that if you look at the record in those cities, and if you look at the history of performance of those agencies, it's not always a success story. So even though there's a lot of conceptual appeal there, there are some real challenges with making that work. Probably the most common example of citizen oversight of the police that we see around the U.S. is citizen review boards or citizen review commissions that are created in communities of varying sizes around the U.S. to review some percentage of the complaints and investigations into police wrongdoing. And there are a lot of different ways that that can be, what cases will go to the Citizen Review Board or what cases will not go. Communities have come up with a lot of different solutions to that question. So even if you look at, those review boards, they're not homogenous. They're very diverse in how they operate. They do have some commonalities. They tend to be made up of citizen volunteers. They rarely have a professional staff. And so where there's a high caseload or a high sort of workload, one of the challenges there is that it can become very burdensome to ask a group of volunteers, many of whom don't have a great deal of training, although some communities have gone, have done some really great work in training citizen volunteers. But it can be very hard to review a high volume of investigations for those volunteer boards. In Denver, for example, we get 900 or 1,000 complaints every year of misconduct that range all the way from inappropriate use of force and deadly force, all the way to much sort of less serious cases. And some of those investigations into those complaints are extraordinarily complex. There's a tremendous volume of evidence. With the addition of body cameras, we're now seeing dozens of hours of footage and potentially more, all of which is extraordinarily time-consuming to review. So the burden can be very high for citizen boards, but lots of communities have gone that route. I am, as Barry said, the independent monitor in Denver, and that's a different model that a lot of cities have adopted in recent years and has gained, I think, a lot of traction around the U.S. And again, that's not homogeneous either, but the general principle of creating an independent monitor is that you empower an official to review every investigation being conducted by the Internal Affairs Bureau. So Internal Affairs within the police agency will conduct the investigation into the claim of misconduct. And before that case can be closed, it must be shared with the independent monitor or his or her staff, who have the opportunity to review the kind of investigation conducted by internal affairs, the thoroughness, the level of impartiality or partiality in the investigation, and make recommendations to help the police agency correct any errors or problems in the investigation. Generally, independent monitors only have the power to recommend. They don't have the power to control. So they're not ultimately in charge of the investigation. They can only recommend to the chief of police, the commander of the Internal Affairs Bureau, and others how a case should be handled. And that's usually the end of their power. But a very important piece of the independent monitor model is the sort of transparency function. Independent monitors, certainly my office and others, other independent monitors around the country do regular reporting to the public about trends and patterns in complaints, uses of force, discipline. We really prioritize not only that kind of routine reporting, but we also evaluate trends and patterns and launch policy and practice and training evaluations. As we see issues cropping up, we will launch evaluations of those issues to determine whether there are systemic problems at play that can be rectified by the police agency. A couple of recent examples involved, I mentioned body cameras, and the Denver Police Department, to its credit, launched a 6-month pilot project with body cameras. And in the wake of Ferguson and all the other events that we've seen around policing in the U.S. recently, there's been a ton of rhetoric about the value and importance of body cameras and all the things that they would do and achieve for sort of healing the rift between communities and police agencies. And while I think body cameras are a very useful tool at providing objective evidence of what took place in citizen police encounters, I think sometimes some of the rhetoric can become overheated, and we actually wanted to test the impact of body cameras on the Denver Police Department, in particular evaluate uses of force by police officers towards citizens during the pilot project in Denver with body cameras. So we, over the 6-month pilot, we identified every documented use of force by a police officer involving a citizen, and actually sought to evaluate, was the camera activated to record the use of force? What were the privacy issues that were implicated by? I'm in an ACLU meeting, so I assume that there's a sympathetic ear for those concerns. But as we put cameras on police officers, it has significant implications for citizen privacy and officer privacy, as those cameras are going into private homes, houses of worship, hospitals, places where the people generally expect that their conduct is not being recorded and subjected to later review. So we wanted to understand what some of the privacy concerns were associated with body cameras, and a variety of other issues. And we earlier this year issued a report with a very detailed breakdown of what we saw and some of the problems that we identified associated with the way that body cameras were being used by the Denver Police Department, and making 9 policy recommendations so for them to adapt and change their policy to address the concerns that we identified through our study. And the police department has adopted some, but not all of our recommendations. So I could go on in this vein for a while, but I'm not sure that would be the most productive use of our time.
Oh, I'm happy to interrupt you now with just a couple of questions, and then hopefully save the bulk of our time for audience questions. So this whole field is relatively new to me. As Barry pointed out, I know an awful lot about police misconduct in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, but not as much as I might hope about things that happen nowadays. So I guess one question I have, and forgive me if it's overly broad, goes to what you think the proper goals are of oversight. Bearing in mind or suggesting to you that there are some different possibilities there that might not always align. Individual justice or punishment of officers who behave wrongly versus structural reform. You mentioned earlier the concept of healing communities and repairing relationships, and I know a lot of people invest in that. At the same time, that I know there are folks who think that that's an illegitimate purpose in the face of underlying tensions and problems or inherent functions of the police. And I'm not prejudging any of those values. I'm just wondering if someone so very knowledgeable about this, what thoughts you might have about the various functions or goals that this enterprise might have.
Yeah, I think to some extent it's a little bit of, it's probably a little bit of all of those things. You know, if we look at the history, and you're obviously very knowledgeable about the history, if we look at the history of policing in the United States, there have been lots of periods throughout our history of scandal involving police agencies. There have been challenges regarding the ability or willingness of police departments to hold their own accountable. And to some extent, civilian oversight is a reaction to some of those institutional forces within policing. And I need to be clear that I'm speaking in sort of general terms about general historical patterns about police culture, but there are also lots of exceptions to these general patterns. So this is not a condemnation of any particular police agency, but if we look in the aggregate, many police agencies have had a very hard time evaluating the behavior of their own members with fair eyes and conducting rigorous investigations of allegations of wrongdoing by their own members. And so citizen oversight is a reaction to those trends and an attempt to correct them to some extent, to bring an outside pair of eyes to bear on claims of wrongdoing and on investigations into those claims, and hopefully to help nudge, by bringing that outside perspective to the table, hopefully help nudge the police agency in a positive direction of fairly looking at the behavior of its own members. So that's a very important goal. I think there are some successes in that regard, and there are also some failures. It has not been citizen oversight has not been a panacea that has fixed all of those problems. All we have to do is look around at other cases of the last year to identify that it has not fixed all of those problems. But it's one step that communities have taken to try and address that issue.
So you mentioned earlier and in your comments just now, in fact, alluded to the function that these groups can have, organizations can have in prompting a response they wouldn't otherwise get. One version of that you see in a lot of these cases that have arisen in the last few years is the demand for prosecution of officers who appear to be, and we don't always know exactly what happened, but appear to be culpable. I'm not sure myself, as someone who teaches criminal law, that I think about mandatory prosecution, because I'm not sure about the value of prosecution in general. But I am sort of sympathetic to people's arguments that the tough nut to crack here is the investigative discretion of the police and then the prosecutorial discretion down the road. It certainly seems to be a lightning rod of frustration, right, where it seems to the public that something criminal has happened here. We've had a couple cases here recently in Boulder that seem to conform to that pattern where, again, it seems to the public that something really terrible happened, and then after an investigation, the prosecutor, typically the prosecutor, said, well, we're just not going to proceed for whatever reason. Do you envision a role of oversight organizations beyond what they presently have in compelling prosecution? And I just elaborate a little bit. So, the prosecutorial discretion is a broad problem and frustration for a lot of constituencies. And let me emphasize, I'm not saying I support some of the initiatives that these groups have taken. But a lot of victims of sexual assault and other assault crimes are upset when the state doesn't proceed with the case. And some states, like Colorado, have a special prosecutor's law, the existence of which actually proves the rule that you can't really compel the prosecutor to prosecute someone that you don't want to prosecute. Do you think that that's an area of potential reform here? That's something that should be married to the functions of these oversight groups? Or are there some hidden problems there?
Yeah, you know, I think it's a complicated question. You know, rendered more complicated probably because most DAs are elected, and so they have a mandate from the electorate to decide who to prosecute and who not to prosecute. And so how would we craft a new sort of remedy that would strip away that discretion? Or you know, I think certainly some of the problems that I talked about, and again, I'm speaking in general terms and not about any particular, you know, prosecutorial office, but some of the problems that I talked about with respect to police officers reviewing their own conduct, you know, may apply in some ways with respect to prosecutors who work extraordinarily closely, sort of hand in glove with the police agency reviewing the conduct of police officers. Some of the same incentives may exist to exculpate the behavior of an accused officer when you have a prosecutor who is, you know, works very closely with that officer or his or her colleagues. So, you know, I think communities are wrestling with that question right now. There's a proposal, and maybe another proposal in the coming legislative session, you know, regarding special prosecutors here in the state of Colorado. And I'm not sure that anybody has figured out how to deal with that yet. I don't know that civilian oversight is going to be the answer there, but I think it is something that a lot of communities are wrestling with, and I understand why.
I'll ask one more question, and this one much more straightforward. Is capture of agencies a problem? And if it is, what are some of the ways that it might be dealt with?
Yeah. So you know, regulatory capture, if you will, is a problem for you know, lots and lots of agencies that do regulatory work or quasi-regulatory work. You know, just look at, I mean, there are lots and lots of examples of agencies that do regulatory work becoming so close to the body that they're supposed to be regulating that they sort of forget why they're there in the first place. And I think that is a problem in with certain civilian oversight bodies. I think there are ways, there are sort of structural things that can be put in place to try to mitigate the risk that will happen. So I think it's important that there be, and I guess I'm speaking for myself rather than as a representative of the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, but I think that there should be very clear divisions between an oversight entity and the police department that is regulating. There should be no reporting to the police chief or the police agency. So whether it's a citizen review board or an independent monitor or whomever, that person should not be appointed by, in my personal view, a police chief or the police agency. And there should be the law, you know, the ordinance that creates the oversight body should have very clear provisions about independence, that the decisions of the oversight body must reflect the independent judgment of that body. There should be no attempt to unduly influence the judgment of members of that, you know, oversight board, and other. There are other examples that communities have adopted into the sort of foundational legal language to create some protections and trying to prevent capture from happening. Has it been perfect? No, but I think there are steps that we can take.
Good. I'd like to open up the discussion to people in the audience if there are any questions. I think my job is to call on folks to moderate. I don't think that's going to be a particular problem for us this evening. Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, do the civilian oversight groups have powers such as subpoena power and power to get documents, take testimony from witnesses or depositions? Do they have those kinds of investigatory powers?
It depends, it depends where you look, and it depends what, oversight body you're looking at. I think those powers are important to have, you know, so I certainly would recommend that any oversight body, you know, have the power to subpoena documents. The power to, compel testimony is, somewhat complicated, by, you know, a series of legal precedents. The Garrity versus New Jersey from the United States Supreme Court from several decades ago has rendered it very complicated for any outside body to compel a police officer to give a statement, you know, without running afoul of the Constitution and the right to not self-incriminate. So the police chief can force a police officer to come in and give a statement, but there's some significant legal problems with oversight entities being able to do it. Actually, there's a case from Colorado from the Court of Appeals that sort of grappled with that question. From an earlier era, Denver has had a history of different civilian oversight bodies, and there was a Public Safety Review Commission that sought to compel testimony from police officers, and so there's a Court of Appeals decision on that point. Yes, you know, oversight bodies should, in my view, have as much power to compel information as possible, but it's complicated.
Yes, sir.
I'm interested in your thoughts on it. I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of what's going on in police and the news these days is very polarizing, and you know, it tends to close the rank and file the thin blue line, so to speak. And at least in my experience, you know, knowing police officers and whatnot, vast majority of them do an incredibly hard job, do really well. There are a lot of bad apples, but what are your thoughts on kind of a hybrid oversight? In my experience, it would be, and I now that the military, it's much more effective to have a police officer who's been in the position of one who's not, you know, living up to the standard, judge that person and say, you know, I've been in your shoes, I can judge you, and that lower ranking officer will respect that person a lot more, as opposed to having a civilian who's never been in that situation, where even if that police officer stepped way outside of their training, made poor judgment, the rest of the police department is really going to say, you have no standing to judge us in this situation. So is there any kind of, you know, hybrid civilian police oversight, or perhaps civilians in an oversight position or ex-police officer or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there are agencies and review boards that have members that are former police officers or even potentially current police officers, and so that model exists. I think it's sort of following some of the same logic that you've laid out. You know, I will say that certainly having discipline handed down by someone with a police background or a police officer, at least theoretically, could, you know, it's possible that an officer might be willing to accept it a little bit more easily, but we see sort of appeals to civil service commissions, we see appeals of discipline even when it's being handed down by police chiefs in cities that don't have oversight around the country. So I'm not sure that we've seen a correlation necessarily that police officers are more willing to accept a disciplinary outcome if it comes from the police agency as opposed to coming from an oversight body.
The lady in blue here, I think.
Okay, that would be me. So you brought up a couple things, body cameras, Ferguson. So with regard to body cameras, how do you think that affects an officer's ability to enter a situation and engage in terms of community engagement? You know, I'm not talking about a hostile situation, I'm talking about, you know, just a routine call in terms of establishing a rapport with the person he's responding to. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that, and you know, and the effect, and somebody brought it up, he did, the effect that all this monitoring has on our police. What message are we sending them, and does that indeed polarize the police and create the opposite effect that we want, and where's the support for the police? You know, there was all this outcry of support after Ferguson, which I understand, but, you know, you can't paint all police with the same brush. And, but that's what's happened since then, so how do you deal with that? And are you worried about losing the good cops over this, you know, micromanaging?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot, I think there's a lot in your question there. I think certainly, times are very, very difficult in policing right now in the U.S. I think there's some huge opportunities for police officers and police agencies to grow in new ways because of where we're at, but by the same token, you know, when I talk to police officers in Denver and in other places, you know, I think they have a sense that anytime anyone wearing a uniform does anything wrong anywhere in America, they're personally being held accountable for everything that's done wrong by any police officer anywhere. And I think that's putting them under tremendous strain and putting them under the microscope in ways that may be counterproductive and where we might lose you know, very good officers because of that kind of, because they're being painted with a broad brush and painted as being bad because of things that other people have done. So yes, I am concerned about that. By the same token, civilian oversight is not about painting anyone with a broad brush. It's about, yes, it's about heightened scrutiny, and it's about looking very closely at allegations of wrongdoing because they are serious and they do merit a higher level of public review. But it doesn't mean going out and trying to find cops in the wrong. It means you know, fairly evaluating the facts, bringing an outside perspective to help the department fairly evaluate the facts, perhaps more effectively than they were able to do it before. So civilian oversight and monitoring doesn't mean painting people with a broad brush, and so I don't think, you know, while people may feel under the microscope because there's been a review board created or an independent monitor created, you know, I don't think that it's doing the things that you raised in your question. I'm not sure if I don't think I answered everything, but we can always maybe come back to
You can maybe circle back. Yes, Steve.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Incredibly informative. Chapter's been working on this issue for a long time. The city, in response to some of what the ACLU and others have said, have hired the independent firm Hilliard Hines to do a review, and among their tasks is, I'm just reading from a news article here, make recommendations based on best practices for cities similar in size and complexity of Boulder about how the city could build upon its current processes for addressing complaints from community members about Boulder officers and their conduct. Boulder currently has a review board of which half are police and half are appointed by the city manager on the recommendation of the police. So that's the current set of affairs. Of course, there's also an internal affairs for the police. So what do you think of Hilliard Hines, and what do you think of where Boulder should go?
So, you know, I haven't studied what you've got now. I mean, that's a pretty broad sketch of what you've got now, and so I'm going to, you know, again take off my hat, you know, my National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement hat and speak about my personal views. You know, I think that there is, you know, some potential loss in value in having oversight where the members of the review panel, if that's the model that Boulder chooses to move forward with, are appointed by the agency that they're supposed to be overseeing. I think that from a public confidence perspective, you could have some loss in potential impact from a you know, are you getting the right people on the panel perspective? I think it you know, you might have some challenges there. So without studying, you know, in detail what you have here, my gut reaction is that A better approach would probably be to create some clear sort of pathways for appointment to whatever panel you have that don't necessarily rely upon being picked by the police department.
What about Hilliard Plan? Are you familiar with that?
I am. They did a project for the city of Denver this past year assessing the state of the Denver Sheriff Department and issued a got to be close to 300-page report on sort of operational problems in the jails. And of course, in Denver, the police department polices the streets, and the sheriff department administers the jails. And they did some good work in that project.
Well, in fact, this gentleman here in the black has his hand up.
Yeah, so last time I went to a Denver City Council meeting, I want to say it was months ago, and it was to support giving the Office of Independent Monitor more strength, and I think there's few cities that need it more, given North Denver News last year put out a report saying that according to the Center for Disease Control data, law enforcement in Denver was the second most lethal in the country, and we know that that Denver hasn't indicted an officer for murder in 23 years. And so all of that frames the upcoming election for Denver District Attorney. And as background for the question of how do we, both for offices like yours, for civilian oversight, and even as citizens just looking for other solutions. So it's a pretty broad question for you, sir. What other things do you think we aren't doing that could be done? And a second piece is, do you know what would your opinion be on the strongest citizen review board or independent monitor that you've seen, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so two very good questions, and let me say I very much appreciate your having come to City Council to support when we sought to amend the ordinance that created the Office of the Independent Monitor, which was created in the wake of several police shootings in 2004 and 2005. And it became very clear to me when attempting to conduct a policy review and having very significant challenges obtaining the information that I needed to do that review, that the ordinance that created my office needed to be strengthened to make it very clear that the agencies that I oversee need to share the information that we need in a timely fashion, and subject to certain legal restrictions that I won't bore you with. And so we went to City Council to seek that an amendment of the ordinance, and I appreciate you being there for that. Nobody has got this thing figured out, and so these are, civilian oversight is evolving constantly, and cities are experimenting with new approaches. There are a lot of things that Denver, and I think without things that my predecessor created that we do in Denver that are better than what a lot of other cities are doing. There are probably some things that we do worse, or things that we need to work on. There are some new models that are out there that I think are pretty interesting. Like if you look at Newark, New Jersey, the mayor of Newark, a kind of progressive mayor, was recently elected and campaigned in part on a platform of strengthening citizen oversight of the police. And he's created an independent monitor, I believe with a review board, sort of working together with the monitor. And he's actually vested that body with the power to render discipline when they make findings. So he's taken it out of merely the world of making recommendations, and he's actually said this independent monitor and this review board will actually be able to issue disciplinary decisions and impose discipline where it's warranted. And it's, that's pretty uncommon, and we haven't really seen how it works yet. And I think it's certainly an interesting model, one to sort of keep our eye on to see how it works. One potential challenge is that, if one of the key functions of having an independent monitor or a citizen review board is to shine a light on the decisions that are being rendered by the police agency, if the independent monitor is the one making the decision, who's shining the light, on what that official is doing? So to some extent, you trade one problem for another problem, that I'm not sure that anybody has quite figured that piece out yet, but, I think myself and a lot of others will be watching to see how it plays out in Newark, because it's a potentially very promising new model.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm a law student here, at Voice, and we are in the clinic, tech law and policy clinic. And I know that you mentioned body cameras, and I know that we've kind of talked a little bit here about misconduct and kind of ad hoc review boards judging these allegations of misconduct or misbehavior or abuse, whatever the case may be. But you did talk about body cameras, and so I was just curious about your thoughts about surveillance technologies in general, and if there can be some sort of transparency from the beginning, like some preventative measure or review board, monitor, whatever the case may be, that gets public involved and to create a conversation about surveillance technologies that are going to be implemented in cities so that there's input versus them just being deployed and then abuse happening and then having to worry about it. I'm curious if you think that these forms of oversight would be productive in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, those are important questions that, as we roll out, cameras are everywhere now. We're, under, surveillance in a whole variety of ways, when we're out in public. And so I think it's important that as we add to that sort of surveillance burden, if you will, that we're considerate and thoughtful about it, and the public has an opportunity to weigh in. This is one of the reasons why in the report, I think we have a copy here on the front table along with some other materials, that we put out on the pilot project for police body cameras in Denver. One of our recommendations was that the police department really needed to engage in more robust consultations with the community about some of those questions that you're raising before they moved from the pilot phase to sort of permanent deployment of cameras on the street, to wrestle with some of the privacy issues, and some of the other issues that we identified during the pilot. So I do think there's a role for oversight in calling out some of those issues. Another of our recommendations in that report was to scale back the retention period that footage was being retained for, so that we could utilize the footage for evaluating complaints or allegations, but that we didn't develop this sort of multi-year database of footage of sort of activity of the citizens on the street. We didn't really see a lot of value for the city in doing that, and so one of our recommendations was that the police department should shorten the period of time that it was keeping footage for. So I think there is value in having those conversations, and oversight can play a role in those discussions.
John?
Yeah, two questions. Quick ones. How often are your disciplinary recommendations rejected by the chief of police or accepted? And secondly, what commends civilian oversight over unleashing civil rights suits? And are your materials discoverable in this?
Say the second piece again.
What commends civilian oversight as an approach to reform police departments over unleashing civil rights, 1983, I guess, in your case, suits against officers? Why shouldn't we pour our time and energy and effort and money into making it easier to bring and survive 1983 suits against abusive officers?
So I'll do the second one first, because I forgot the first one.
I'll remind you.
So as I mentioned, we get between 900 and 1,000 complaints a year. As you know, there are some pretty high burdens to bringing a 1983 claim, including that you need damages. And if you want to get a lawyer to bring it for you, you need to be able to prove that there's going to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And a significant majority, like an overwhelming majority of the 900 or 1,000 complaints that we get in a year, probably don't have any damage component to them. Now, if it's an excessive force claim and someone is injured, of course, there are damages there. If it's false arrest, there are damages there. But I think it would be very difficult, first of all, if every one of those complaints were to result in a lawsuit, the court system would, probably cease to function. And most of them simply, probably don't belong in court. They belong in some kind of administrative process for assessing whether, a police officer is an employee. We have an employee handbook. Did the officer follow our policies and our guidelines in our employee handbook or not? They don't really, belong in court. Some of them obviously do.
How often are your recommendations rejected or accepted by the chief?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't have a good figure on that. They both happen, not infrequently, and so, we have the power of persuasion and the power of transparency, and so we have to go in and make arguments for why the chief and the manager of public safety in Denver should take a particular course with respect to a particular complaint, and sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not.
We have time for a couple more.
The ACLU in Boulder County is on record for civilian review, independent civilian review. And we suggested a new board rather than one that advises the chief about confidential. So that the cops play with that one. These members are appointed by council after interviews with council members like other city